Welcome to the Virtual Venture Cafe, everyone, and a very special welcome to our first-time community members. Welcome to the family. Before we begin this session, Venture Cafe Cambridge would like to pause for 1 minute to honor George Floyd and in acknowledgement of the pain so many around the country are feeling now. During this moment, we ask that you please reflect on the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that ended Mr. Floyd's life. Thank you very much for taking this time. Venture Cafe Cambridge and Venture Cafe Global Institute will be releasing a racial equity plan to make positive changes in ending systemic racism in our community. And with this, I would like to introduce Danielle Duplin, who is the co-founder and global launch director of Agency. Agency is the worldwide innovation for living better and aging better. It combines co-working for aging-focused startups and enterprises at global CAC hubs with experts, programming, and an international community of innovators. As president at Free Wind Productions, Danielle is an award-winning public speaking coach and innovation producer with more than 30 years of experience as an engineer, corporate executive, and ecosystem builder to help clients inform, inspire, and influence their audiences. With this, Danielle, over to you.
Thank you, Yulia, and thank you for that very profound way to open this session today. Clearly, what we have all experienced firsthand is the impact of implicit bias when go unchecked can have dramatic and tragic outcomes. And so we're here today with an open mind as a community to learn what it means to communicate outwardly with this bias, and how we could reframe the way we think about each other and the way we project how we love and care for one another. So I welcome all of you with an open heart and an open mind, and I'm very excited to welcome our presenter today from the Tufts Health Plan Foundation. It's been an absolute delight and thrill to work with Danielle, and I'm super excited that she's here today. Tufts Health Plan Foundation invests in large sweeping initiatives that help improve the health and wellness of the diverse communities in which they serve. And they've been clearly focused on aging. So there's a lot of exciting work. I encourage you to check out all of their work. So welcome to each and every one of you. We look forward to a very exciting interactive event. You'll get to know one another through some Zoom breakouts. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to my facilitator, Ari Daniels.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you both for that introduction, and thank you for taking a moment to give us all a little bit of time and space to think about the experiences of this week. I appreciate all of you being here today. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you about reframing aging. As Danielle said, I'm at Tufts Health Plan Foundation, and we're the only regional funder focused exclusively on healthy aging. And one of the things that's really important to us is that we find ways to change the conversation about aging in our region and in our country. Changing the conversation is going to help us think about the systems that are in place that are creating some challenges for folks as they age in our communities. And it's really important for us to think about in our own lives as well. I'm grateful for the Foundation's president, Nora Moreno-Cargi, and our team who have really invested in this work and have given me the chance to come and talk to all of you today. So thanks for your time, and I look forward to learning together. I do hope we'll have some time in the chat and the questions to connect. You know, as we move forward, oh, is this going to give me a delay? I can never predict. There we go. You know, we talked a little bit about systems change, and as we move forward, I just want to take a moment to think about where we are in terms of aging in this country. You know, this graph on the screen is from the Census Bureau, and it shows you where we were in terms of a demographic. Oh,
Ollie, 1 second. My apologies for interrupting
sure.
you. Could you please make your slides full screen?
Ah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Tell me what you're seeing.
Of course.
Tell me, are you seeing the presenter view?
Yes.
Okay, let me unshare. Thank you for letting me know that.
Of course. Sorry to interrupt you, but I feel you have so
No,
many interesting.
No problem. Let's see. Tell me. This is what I intended. Is that right?
Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is why I'm grateful. Thank you. So what we have up on the screen is census data, and you know, it shows you how it used to be. It used to be that there was a column. There were more younger people in this country than there were older people. And I said column, I meant pyramid. And now you see on the right, it's much more of a column. There's a more even distribution, which means that the systems that we've had in place for years are probably not going to work the way they used to. Things like defined pension plans and Social Security and workforce decisions that were made based on a pyramid structure. And you know, so what we're facing is how can we think differently in our society? And what's important is also that a lot of the way we think about aging now is based on misperceptions. And it's pretty easy to think about what that can look like in terms of the workforce. But these misperceptions carry over in a lot of ways. Older people ourselves start to internalize the messages and these misperceptions. We see the influence in our marketing. Anybody who's walked down the greeting card aisle in a local pharmacy or big box store can tell you all kinds of things about the misperceptions about aging and black bannered birthday cards and being over the hill. This sign you might think was taken from another era. It was actually a photograph taken in 2019. That is somebody's idea of an acceptable way to depict a crossing for older people. You know, so we have to think about all of these misperceptions and how they exist in the world, and understand that because they've become the dominant cultural way of thinking about aging, it really, we don't even realize in some cases how that we're thinking about them. And one thing that I want to note here that I found particularly troubling is that there's implicit bias, not only externally, but older people ourselves will even make decisions about perhaps not doing things or not discussing certain problems with their medical professionals because they perceive something as a sign of normal aging. So whether it's insomnia or dry eye or something really simple that could be easily cured, if an older person feels that that is something that's normal aging, no treatment, no questions. So that's sort of the impetus for us thinking differently, recognizing that there are some real powerful forces at work here. And before I talk about framing and what that means, we're going to just take a minute and we're going to go into a breakout. What I'd like you all to do is write down a word or two that you associate with aging. And in the breakout, share them to your screens, talk about why you show the words. I think this is a 5-minute breakout, and you're not going to tell me your words, but when we come back, we're going to go on, and in a few minutes, we'll see if any of your words pop up in some of the research that was done on aging in this country. So I'll let Julia get us into the breakout.
So Arlo, you want us to write down a word and then show it on our screen?
Yes, please.
Okay, should we start?
Yes.
Okay.
Are we in one of the breakouts? I can't tell.
We are not in the breakouts yet. Do we want to go to the breakout now? Sure.
Yes.
So we have 36 participants into nine rooms. Is that okay?
That sounds good. I was just telling the folks in our breakout that based on that very small sample, that the folks on this call may be sharing words about aging that are not the typical words that we associate with aging based on the research that's been done, that we have a more evolved and educated group here. So this is going to be a great conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about framing, you know, because people hear the word and they have all kinds of ideas about what it means. And, you know, at its very basic core, it's the idea that the way we present information, the choices that we make, the words that we use, the things that we may choose not to include, that affects how people hear it. That affects the attitudes and understandings and actions, because we are setting it up for folks in a way that will cue up certain thoughts and ideas. And there's a very well-known example of this that sadly was not conducted this week or last year even. This study was conducted in 2004, and reflecting on it this week makes me realize, you know, how deep the systems issues are in our country and how much work we still have to do. But the example is here on the screen, and you can see there were...
Ari, could you go ahead and share your screen again?
Is that the right screen? Are we shared?
There we go. Yep, perfect.
Excellent. Excellent. Technology, it's our friend when it works and we get everything right. So this is a very well-regarded study. It was done by professors at the University of Texas. They're political scientists. And so they asked a group of people a question, and they framed it two different ways. The first one was framed through the value of free speech. Given the importance of free speech, would you favor allowing a hate group to hold a political rally? And 85% of the people polled were in favor based on this framing. And when asked if given the risk of violence, would you favor allowing a hate group to hold a political rally, 40% of people were in favor. And as you can see, the words are highlighted here. It's just a very small choice, but it's queuing up a value that we hold as a really important value in this country, this value of free speech. And you can see there's a really dramatic difference in the response. So, you know, we share this example because it's really key to understand the power of frames, how they shift people's understandings, and they're often used to build movements. And I want to just take a moment to note that the work that I'm going to be presenting on today was done by an organization called the Frameworks Institute. And they are a nonprofit based in DC that does a lot of work on social issues. So most of this work was developed in the idea of making shifts for policy change. So what we're going to be talking about today will be a little bit different for some of you. There are some on the phone who may be really interested in policy change. There are others on the phone who are developing products and services for older people. So the hope is that this knowledge, this understanding that Frameworks has gathered on how folks think about aging in our country and their recommendations about how to talk about aging in older people are something that you can translate to your work. And they're great folks to work with. You can read the slide. There's more information on them. And I have a link to them in the resources later on. But you know, this is the theory. This is the idea about how frames work, that when the experts, and that's you all on the phone, start using different words and different ways about talking about an issue, that changes the public discourse. You know, what we see in the media, what we see on TV, in the newspapers, which eventually starts to change the way people think. And that's what opens up the opportunity for policy change. Folks say, you know, framing can sort of unlock and create some open opportunities in people's minds. So for a really easy example for this is, especially in the New England region, is the idea of marriage equality. I would not be surprised, and if you want to raise your hand, let me know either by raising your hand in the screen or by pressing the raise your hand button. You know, how many of you remember about 20 years ago, the conversations that were happening here? Vermont was talking about civil unions, Massachusetts was talking about gay marriage. There's a lot of energy around these ideas here in New England. And as that conversation moved across the country, people thought that we were really on the brink of seeing some real change. And then to people's surprise, especially the organizers of the movement, the gay marriage movement got to California and it hit a roadblock. Proposition was voted down, and the organizers really had to regroup and rethink about what they were doing. They worked with some folks. It was not Frameworks Institute, it was another organization. They worked with some folks to understand what they needed to do, how to retool their message. And the advice that they were given was to change the way they were talking in very subtle ways. The conversation about gay marriage was about rights and benefits. The advice was that most of us don't think about our relationships based on rights and benefits. We think about our relationships based on love and commitment. Those are the common values. So the advice was to retool and to focus on love and commitment and marriage equality. And that's what the group did. And that is credited with making these major changes that brought us to a new law, a Supreme Court decision, and where we stand today in this country. It's not short-term change, it's long-term change. But this is how we think about social issues. This is how we think about changing the conversation and getting folks to invest in a new way of thinking and a new openness. This next slide just shows you that Frameworks has done a lot of work on a lot of different social issues. And in the resources, you'll see a link to Stanford Social Innovation Review, and you can read their findings and their recommendations on all of these topics. I will tell you, it's really interesting to see some of the common themes, and I have found it helpful to read about some of the other issues, particularly the ones I'm interested in, and that informs how I think about my aging work as well. So I share this slide to let folks know that that's available. And then the last thing I'll say about the framework specifically to this research is what I'm sharing is based on a very long research project. It was over 2 years. The team at Tufts involves social scientists, linguists, anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists. They use a variety of research methodologies. Their sample size was over 12,000, as you can see. And so when we come and are able to share the recommendations with you, it's not based on somebody saying they like this word better than that word. They're based on demonstrable changes in attitudes, policy support, and a decrease in implicit bias as a result of using the different words. So I think that's really important to understand the background of how we got to this work. So Frameworks tells us, and we're about to put a poll up because we'd like to hear from you on this. Frameworks tells us that in order for us to know how we're going to think about, or how we're going to talk about aging, how we're going to change the way we talk, that we need to know how people think, because we're not communicating into empty space. We're communicating into existing preconceived notions. So I'm going to let Julia put up the poll and see if you can all tell me, how old is old? Ah, the poll is down here on the other screen. Let's see if we see any results coming in. So we have 80 plus is in the lead. We have a couple of people who say 70, a few people who think age is 20 years older than I am. And look at that. This is a great group. So the research tells us that we have so internalized the bias against age that we define old on how old we are. There was an extensive study in, let me see if I can get the name of the publication right, Frontiers in Psychology. It was done in 2018. And it says when people become older adults, they recognize that older people are a stigmatized group, and they do everything they can to distance themselves from that group. So old age to most of us in this country is some distant point, 10 or 20 years older than we are. So that's kind of our starting point for the conversation, is understanding that folks have this notion of old as being a stigma and something that we have to address. So I have a photo up here, and I'd like you all to chat into the chat box, and Danielle is going to monitor it for me. I want to know what you see in the photo. I want to know what is there, because we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of cultural models and how our lived experience influences how we receive information. And this usually is a pretty fun exercise. Danielle, are you getting any responses in the chat box? I love watching the puzzled looks on folks. They're trying to say, what could she want me to say? Whatever you see.
Well, clearly we have a group of innovators on the call because one came in, tracks to the future, which I love. Yes, heavy big tracks uphill, a beach with vehicle tracks, tire treads in the sand, turtle tracks from dragging something, tracks, but it's all dirt. Baby turtles heading home.
Awesome, awesome. So lots of tires, driving, lots of ideas of that. So I will point out we're in New England and you're allowed to drive on the beaches up here. I've done this presentation places where that's not the case and you don't get as many people saying that, which I find really interesting. This is a photo, and somebody had it. I heard Danielle say it. This is a photo of turtle tracks. Sea turtles come up onto the shore. They crawl up the sand. They dig a big hole. They lay their eggs, and then they crawl back. And so those are the tracks that they leave behind. And the reason I share it is because what you see is based on information that you already have. We are bombarded with information all day. And our brains are very sophisticated and very smart, and they have been designed to take shortcuts and be efficient. And so they rely on these things called cultural models to organize and assess the information that comes in and connect it to something that we already know. And so understanding the dominant cultural models about aging help us understand where our messages are going when we're talking to folks. So let me show you another way that we see this. We've got one word on this. There we go. We've got one word up on the screen, and I'm interested for you to chat in and tell me your immediate association with this word. Quick association. We're not going to spend too much time on this because I've got one other word coming in.
So clearly we are in Patriot Nation here. So a lot of football, a lot of TB12, and Boston. So patriotic, you know, flag, red, white, and blue. Sam Adams.
There we go.
Also, we're the home of Raytheon, so the Patriot missiles.
We did get the missiles.
Yeah.
Lexington and Concord is another one that we get. All right, I'm going to put up one other word. Same thing. Chat in what you're thinking. Quick, instant reaction, please.
So Kermit the Frog, okay? I love that.
It's not easy being green.
It's not easy being green. And clearly if you're a tree, it's not easy being a tree either, because there's a lot of, you know, eco-friendly and environmental sustainability plants, but also another Bostonian, the green line on the T.
Nice.
And the,
nice. Yeah. Nice. So did we get, so this is really seasonal, and it tells me a lot about whether I've got sports fans on the call. So sometimes I get the Green Monster, sometimes I get the Celtics, usually get something about the economy or Ireland. So the point
there's that too.
right. So the point of all this is that there are no good words or bad words, right? They're words. And you hear a word and you have cultural models, and the words cue up the cultural models. So that's what happens. And I love these words because they just show such a range, and they show that you don't know how someone's going to receive it. And we make adjustments based when we have that knowledge. So basically what Frameworks has done, and I should actually take a moment to pause and say, I recognize the irony that this slide says swamp, and that the word swamp has a lot of other connotations as I'm talking about cultural models. So if you prefer to think of this as a bog or a wetlands or some other complex ecosystem, that is totally fine. The idea here is that our minds already have associations with different images and words. And there are good things in ecosystems like orchids, and there are bad things like alligators. And so this is a map, if you will, a chart of what is in the minds of the typical person in this country associated with aging. And I'm going to go through this, and I'll give you a couple of examples of how it manifests, and then we'll talk a little bit more. Now, based on my breakout, none of these things came up in my breakout. Our breakout had a very evolved group of people. So we may find that some folks on this call are going to not carry the typical cultural models. So what do we have? If we start up at the top, just to the right, we see us versus them. This is an immensely dominant notion in the United States, that we like to otherize. And this evokes this idea of if more for me means less for you. That's what we mean by zero sum. And older people are the other, the elderly, the senior citizens. We would never refer to we are all aging. The typical thing is to say those old people. I have a colleague who has a mother who is in her 90s who says, I don't want to go hang out with those old people. You know, reinforcing that notion that old is always 10 or 20 years older than I am. So that is the dominant narrative. Not aging is living. Old people are the other, they're over there. And we really see this, we've seen this a lot in this intergenerational, these intergenerational headlines, boomers versus millennials. And we really have seen this around the coronavirus. We heard some leaders saying things that, grandparents should be willing to sacrifice so that the economy can get back to work. We've really seen a lot of tension around the idea of older people as the other. So that's a very dominant narrative. And it's something that we have to be very aware of. And it's one of the hardest things for me, I will tell you. The second thing to the right here is individualism. And this is the idea that we believe, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, that older people's health and standing and standard of living are based on lifestyle choices and financial planning decisions. There is not, generally speaking, an acknowledgement that there are a lot of other factors, including the social determinants of health that will influence how people age and their health as they age. At the middle and the bottom, we see the threat of modernity and nostalgia. This idea that in the good old days, grandma and grandpa lived nearby and families took care of them. And in the good old days, everybody had a pension and Social Security. And, in the good old days, we had, a different approach to each other. And what's absent from this thinking is the awareness that the good old days were not good for everyone. That, we had a lot of divisions in our society, and there were a lot of challenges. And reflecting back on the good old days and wishing for something that actually probably never was really prevents us from moving forward. So evoking those good old days images actually makes it very difficult for people to see innovation and possibilities in the future. If we move over to the left, you'll see solutions. And when you ask the general public, because again, this was mapped out by Frameworks research that was done over several years. And the folks that they asked were 12,000 people representative of the demographics in the United States. So if you ask this group to tell you what solutions there might be that we could put in place to help people age more healthily, nothing we can do. The problem is so overwhelming. It cues up a very fatalistic response, and it pulls out all that crisis mode that we have as humans. So nothing we can do. If pressed to ask folks to describe what could be a possible solution, they default to that individualism and that idea that each person should plan better, either their finances or make better health choices or whatever it is. And some of them will say, oh, well, we should educate folks and give them information. But there is no sense that we could think about this as a collective. There's no sense of societal supports. And then the last alligator in this swamp is up here in the top left. And this fascinates me because there are two completely contrasting ideas of aging that folks hold simultaneously. On the one hand, folks view aging as a pharmaceutical commercial or a cruise ship or a golf resort. You know, people who are healthy and able and walking around and enjoying the fruits of their labor and, you know, fancy clothes, watches, cars. They're staying active. They've earned this leisure. And at the very same time, folks have this other contrasting idea of aging that I call the Ds. It's decrepitude, deterioration, decline. And the only thing that these two contrasting ideas have in common is that they're both focused on the individual. There's no thought about how aging is something that happens as, you know, society moves, and that there's a large group. The light green boxes on this slide are the orchids, the opportunities that we can use to cue, to get people thinking and moving in the direction that we want them to think in. As a culture, and particularly I would argue in New England, we believe that problems can be solved. We believe in innovation and ingenuity. We live in a part of the country that has the first public schools, the first public transportation, the first public health officer. Paul Revere was the public health officer for the city of Boston. So we live in a part of the country that really understands that when we come together, that there are certain things that society ought to do for the public good, for public health. And we live in a country overall that understands that. So queuing up that problems can be solved and through collective responsibility is super important. And there is a little bit and more each year, I believe, this idea that where we live, work, and play influences our health, and so that we can pull on that. So, you know, this idea of learning and understanding what people think is based on using it, right? So if we understand what people think, then that helps us when we make our communications choices, because then we know how to navigate around. We can reframe our messages using this knowledge to cue up what we want folks to think about. So when Frameworks thinks about this work, they make a very specific recommendation. They tell us that it's really important to tell a new story about aging, that there are 3 building blocks that we have to think about. Leading with values, and this is really important. I am not saying data is not important. I am not saying don't use data, but I'm saying it's really important to lead with values. And we'll talk a little bit more about some specific values. The next step, explain. Don't assume that folks really understand, you know, what the concern or the issue or the challenge is. One way of explaining can be using a metaphor. And then the last thing is always offer a solution. And this is counterintuitive to me because I work in a very collaborative environment, and I always think, well, if I offer a solution, I don't want people to think I'm telling them I know the answer. You know, you want to leave space for people to contribute. But the research shows that when faced with, you know, some big challenge, when a solution is offered, that opens up people's minds to the possibilities of other solutions. So it's actually a really important thing to think about.
And I would just like to pause here because that's why I'm so thrilled that we're bringing this work into a community of innovators and people who are launching startups based on a brilliant idea that they have to help the aging journey. And so I'm loving this connection of leading with values, explaining with metaphors that aren't trite. But indeed, you know, the whole role of innovation is to lead with a solution mindset. So so thank you for laying this map out for us.
Frameworks, thank Frameworks. I'm the vessel.
Okay.
But so, you know, oftentimes when I talk about metaphors or talk about a narrative, I can tell when I'm in the room with people, I get a little bit of a, uh-oh, I wasn't there that day in 10th grade English. So I just want to pause for a minute and say 2 things. Number 1, a narrative is just telling a story. These are just 3 elements to include when you're telling your story. And metaphors are everywhere. Well, I give a couple of examples. I want folks to chat in because we often learn some new ones. But one of my, you know, if you listen to music, is one of the places that I think you hear them the most. depending on the generation on the phone. So we've got Katy Perry's song, Baby You're a Firework, right? That's a metaphor. Forrest Gump, life is a box of chocolates. We all have an instant image of what that looks like, right? You don't know what's coming. There's an assortment in the box. There's a song that was really popular several months ago by Maren Morris, If the Bones Are Good. It talks about if the bones are good, the glass won't shatter. It's the idea of a house. But, you know, we have these instant images when we hear metaphor. Did we get any in on the chat, Danielle? Because we usually get some interesting suggestions from folks.
So you're looking for metaphors for aging specifically?
It could be aging. It just could be a common metaphor that folks have heard. Shakespeare, life is a stage. The reason that I like to ask people to think about metaphors that they might recognize is to get folks past the idea that this is something for English majors, or get folks to see how common they are, because they really are embedded throughout all of our literature and our music and our movies. And it's a tool that we can use very effectively to make our messages more sticky and more memorable to pass along to other folks.
So this is really profound. Your age is beyond your own control. How old you are is completely up to you.
That's a great statement. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And aging is a journey. I love that metaphor.
Yes.
So it's not a point in time that you arrive. It's the wholeness of your life.
Awesome.
Lovely.
Awesome. So we've got 3 building blocks, and I'm going to give you 2 examples of putting those building blocks together to tell a story. So here's the first example. Oops, how about if I stay where I belong? Okay, so here's the first example. And this is using the value of maximizing your potential, maximizing our potential. And, you know, I mentioned earlier that Frameworks had done research. I want to be clear, when we talk about leading with a value, I know many of you work for organizations that have values. We all have our own personal values. In this case, Frameworks has tested values. You know, they've gone out to folks and they've given them different sentences or different scenarios. So we're talking about values that have been demonstrated to move people's thinking in a positive, productive way about aging. So this is one of them, and it's this idea that we want everyone to be able to maximize their potential. So you could start a conversation or start your story by saying, when we support well-being, we make sure everyone can maximize their potential and fully contribute to communities. And this helps our communities thrive and remain vibrant. And I should say that anything you've learned about plagiarism does not apply to these slides. You can take the words that are on the slides and use the sentences exactly as they are. The slides themselves, not so much, but, you know, take the words, use them for your own work. Repetition is really important in reframing and changing the conversation. So you set somebody up. We're all going to agree maximizing potential is a good thing, right? So you start there. And then we have this metaphor about social supports. We need our communities to have solid beams or solid foundation so that we create the conditions that everybody can fully participate. This gets people thinking about coordinated action, bigger picture thinking. So, well, I'm going to go to the next slide and then I'll come back to what I was going to say here. And then the solution. We know that it's really important for healthy aging that there are community resources and social relationships and opportunities to thrive. This would be a great way to describe the Go-Go Grandparent Service. It is a way that folks who don't have a smartphone can use Uber and Lyft. They can call from their landline or they could call from a flip phone. They can talk to somebody, they can get connected to Uber and Lyft. So the idea here is that there's a structure in society. There's this transportation network that exists. There was that connecting piece that needed to be made so that older folks could continue to be involved in faith-based activities, could continue to volunteer, could go to the library or a medical appointment on their own. And so this solution was available to do it. So that's one way that you can put a story together with a specific example that might be a little bit similar to some of the things that you all could be thinking of. The second example I will share is this value of ingenuity. And the frameworks folks tell us that this tested off the charts, that this was a very, very successful way to cue people up to be open-minded to new ideas and to thinking in a different way, and to be thinking about aging as the time of accumulated wisdom. So tapping into our ingenuity to figure out ways to make our communities ready to support older people in well-being in later life. So lots of ways to talk about ingenuity. It might be about innovation, which aligns beautifully with the work that many of you are doing. So that's the value you lead with. And then you move on. You have a chance to talk about aging. Aging is a dynamic process. As we get older, we gather momentum, built up experience and insights. We evolve. This momentum can add power and force to our communities and help us all move forward. So again, this is language that you can use and drop in as appropriate to your work. And I encourage you to think about how that works. And a solution is what, the organization that brought us all here today. We see that when bringing older entrepreneurs together in a collaborative space leverages the wisdom and leverages the momentum of experience and wisdom that we accumulate. Our tech innovators can tap into those insights and ideas. So I'm not talking about, rewriting every word and everything that you've got. I'm talking about selectively looking for ways to infuse the messages of ingenuity, innovation, momentum, maximizing potential into work that you've already done, into materials that you already have. Before we go into the breakout, I'm going to just share one example here that is another way to tell the story. So this was also tested by frameworks. This is this confronting injustice narrative. And so what's really important here is, we talked at the beginning about ageism a little bit, and in general, people in this country do not understand what ageism means, because it's stereotyping and it's a prejudice based on age. We've seen it a lot against older people lately. We could see it against younger people. We see it in the workplace. We've recently seen it in healthcare. So I'm just going to read you an example while I leave this up on the screen, because I think they did a very, very nice job. This was something that was put together during the coronavirus. A just society strives to treat all people equally. So there's something particularly unjust about characteristics beyond our control, like our age, determining whether or not we receive medical care. We must focus on the relevant clinical factors for each person and case when considering how to distribute resources fairly without placing arbitrary weight on age. So this was a statement from the American Geriatric Society in response to some states developing guidelines for allocating resources where the guidelines included people over a certain age be deprioritized. So, I want to just be really clear. Ageism is real and it's important. In the face of where we stand today, there's a lot of isms in the world that we are facing. And they're not all the same. And there's a lot of intersectionality where people are experiencing multiple at once. So, we're talking about doing a workshop, and we can have a chance to dig in a little bit more, because using this narrative, I think, has to be done with a little bit of sensitivity. But it's really important to understand that ageism is a real thing and that we need to be aware of it. And it's an implicit bias that most of us are not aware of. And so we want to make sure that we're not cueing in to anything that would bring that to the forefront. So one of the challenges for folks when they leave one of these presentations is that they say, okay, I got it, that makes sense, but I don't remember any of the words that you said, or I don't know quite how I'm going to translate them. So we have set aside a 15-minute breakout of small groups again. And so what we'd like you to do is brainstorm and specifically think about the phrase building momentum, and think about other ways you could describe it. Think about it in terms of your own work, acceleration, movement, forward motion. And it may also be helpful to be thinking about antonyms. One group that I worked with last year said that for them, that's the way we've always done it was an antonym for building momentum. And it opened up their minds to realizing that they had to communicate differently with some of the folks that they had to get their funding from, because they had been sort of stuck in a specific mindset of how things were always done a certain way. So I'm going to stop talking, and I will let the masters set up the breakout rooms. And when we come back, I'm hoping that you will be able to share. We've allotted some time so that we can learn from each other and share our synonyms and antonyms.
Okay. And I think too, Ari, we'll let's do this for about 10 minutes, just
That's
because
fine.
I think, so everybody also get to know each other, introduce yourselves and the work that you're doing in aging and what you're building. And I think it's going to be really fascinating to associate this notion of building momentum, and I'm loving the maximizing potential and ingenuity, and how you're framing what it is that you're building using those as a frame. So, all right, Yulia, send us off into some breakouts.
Sure, Danielle, if I may ask, there are 38 of us in the room at this point. So how many people do you want in one room?
Why don't we do 5?
Oh, sure, sounds good.
Okay.
Enjoy the conversations.
Thank you.
And we'll be back in about 10 minutes.
Did we lose anyone?
Hi, welcome back. Hi, Nancy. Welcome back.
I think I'm unmuted successfully, and I'm going to
sorry,
share
I sent you those
screen.
notes.
Okay, I want to make sure I share the screen properly. You guys will tell me if I did it right. So
Yep.
we have a couple of minutes. I'm hoping that we'll have some folks who are willing to share some of the words. And as we think about who's going to be brave and do that, I just want to say that one of the reasons that this has proven to be really, really helpful in previous workshops is that we can put together a list and share it with all of you. And when you are starting to think about what you want to write and how you want to present your work, it can be a nice inspiration to look at the list of words, get you in the right headspace, get your energy going. And the antonyms list can be a little bit of a cautionary tale of, if not for your own words, but maybe even be a signal in conversations like, this is somebody who is, thinking about tradition. Oh, I know that might mean that they're going to be a little bit resistant. So I'm going to, think about momentum in a different way. So if you raise your hand, then I will have Julia unmute you. And so we can hear voices and hear some of the words.
Well, I'll get started. I'll warm everybody up. So we had a very lively conversation. Oh, people are wondering how to raise your hand. If you kind of...
Yeah, I don't see it.
Yeah, okay. So we started with the physics definition of momentum, which is, objects at rest stay at rest and objects in motion stay in motion. And that actually proved a very useful frame, because when we think about marketing strategies that kind of say, well, once you're old, you're kind of sitting down and not moving and you're not leaving your house and it's very stationary. But like, let's use that idea that no, like keep going, keep living, keep doing the things you want to do. So it was a very useful metaphor that also showed the values.
Well done.
Yes.
So somebody else was having trouble raising the virtual hand, but you could raise your physical hand in the camera. Your camera's on.
All right. We had a really interesting chat, and we took some metaphors from startups from the business point of view. So basically looking at a startup and then going along with user engagement, casual versus continuous usage, and then stalling, taking a pause, re-engaging, and then speeding along with lots of momentum, and then plateauing, and then pausing again, but shifting. And it's kind of almost simultaneous with some of the COVID stuff going on, but we took it from we had a good group. So that's what we talked about.
Nice.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. I saw another hand.
Yeah, yeah, here. Yeah.
Is that Paula?
Hi. There were two of us. We had a bit of trouble initially getting connected, but we spoke about, I spoke about how I viewed myself and as kind of a reverse trajectory. But Laurie spoke about gaining ground, and that I think was a really powerful metaphor, and it really went a long way in covering lots of bases of how we were feeling about things, of moving forward, accelerating, all that.
Awesome. Awesome. I think we have time for one more. Did we have another hand up?
I thought I saw Nancy Hoden. Nancy, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I did. You know, we talked about, there were two of us in the room, and we really took a different approach than most of you are taking. And we really started thinking about how do you build momentum for change, and as opposed to just momentum itself. And very sensitive to the fact that change, meaning the end or the adjustment of people's attitudes towards ageism and towards age, and how it is still the last acceptable form of discrimination on a global basis. So we talked about redefining and reimagining and the value of experience and bringing people together on an intergenerational basis, that would bring momentum to that change.
Love that. And I'm glad you said the word reimagining, because it reminds me of two things. Number one, in the resources I want to point out, there is a link to the Reimagining Massachusetts, which is the age-friendly Massachusetts state plan. We happen to live in one of the first states in the country that has a commitment to making the entire state age-friendly. The governor has a council on the Council to Address Aging in Massachusetts, and we have the first state plan in the country. So you can get a link to that. Depending on what it is you're working on, you can see the kinds of priorities that have been set and where the energy is for different things happening across the Commonwealth. The other resource that I wanted to mention is the Healthy Aging Data Reports. This is a project that we funded, research done by the Gerontological Institute at UMass Boston, and you can go deep into the individual communities in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, and really learn a little bit more about your communities and get data on older people in your community. So they could be very helpful resources depending on what you're doing. So I'm glad that that came up, because there were a couple of things up top that I wanted to mention and I didn't. So that's awesome. Okay.
So, Ari, can I just share one more thing that came out in our group? Only because Nancy hails from the Global Coalition on Aging, so she's looking at aging across many cultures around the world. So she and I met in Finland. So, and in our little breakout, so Margaret, I'm gonna ask you. Margaret is she has an interesting view. She's from Canada, on how in the States there's this division between commercial representation for aging and nonprofits. So just super quick, Margaret, what are your observations?
Yeah, so my observation is that when I look at a commercial side, a lot of the US ads, it's all about holidaying, incontinence products, or things like that. That's paint a very one-dimensional picture of the older person. But if we look to the nonprofit sector in US, there's a lot of rich imageries, and it speaks very well of the potential that exists in older age. And one that I was talking about in particular is Seniors Corp in the US, where seniors actually spend a lot of time intergenerationally with children, youth, mentoring them and spending time. So just an observation I have. And just a quick other one is another interesting place to look at in terms of cultural and aging is actually Japan. So in Japan, there's a lot of interesting aspects. So they even have like fashion show where older people dress up just like younger people, very fancy, unique, trendy clothing. So there.
Nice.
That's a great example, and it's a good reminder that we have opportunities to learn from other cultures and see what is happening in other cultures. We've been talking a lot about the US, so thank you for sharing. Thank you for introducing Margaret, and thank you for sharing, Margaret. So the next few slides that I have are specific examples from frameworks of how you could reframe existing language. And I'm not going to read the before and the after, but I am going to read the after because I want to just put some emphasis on, well, actually, you can all read. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually just going to look at the after slide because I want to make sure we leave time for questions. So on this first slide, if you look at reframed with ingenuity, you can see in the second line, we need innovative approaches. And then you can see this call to the ability for folks to continue to contribute to our communities, our economy, and our culture. Rethinking, that's another word. We talked about reimagining. Rethinking, that's a great word to use. Policies that were developed in an earlier era. So that's kind of a subtle nod to, you know, we don't have to hold on to tradition. We can make sure the systems that shape our lives, from transportation to health, are updated and suited to a society with more older people. So, you know, you can see on the left, there's a lot of data. Again, data is important. Definitely not saying that we don't use data. I'm saying that we want to open up the conversation with values and create the conditions, unlock, if you will, people's minds so that they can hear the rest of what you're going to say. So let's go on to the next one. So this one is specifically reframed with building momentum. So we see this: Americans are living longer and healthier lives. This modern miracle can change our society for the better. People build momentum. So we use that exact phrase. But then we go on to say, with the accumulation of experience and insight pushing them forward. So adapting workforce policies in creative ways. We're nodding to ingenuity there. Our civic life can be powered by this momentum. And if we don't, we run the risk of wasting that energy. So that's a negative, but that's another way to do it. And then I have, I believe, one more of these. Yes. So we talked about us versus them when we were talking about the swamp. And I said at the time, this is one of the things that's hardest for me. Danielle made reference earlier to the idea that aging is living. And that's really the core of this message here, that reframing for ourselves, reprogramming ourselves so that we include ourselves in aging regardless of our age, because we're all aging from the moment we're born. So in our own language, to be really, really mindful about using those first person pronouns. So as more Americans live longer lives, it's time for us to figure out that how we can all stay connected to our community as we age. Home delivered meals, we can still count on being included in our communities. Risks social isolation poses to our health. The otherization, the power with otherization is really strong. And unfortunately, you know, we all know what that looks like because we've seen it in a lot of other cases. So everything that we can do when we're talking about aging and older people is to remember that, you know, literally we're all in this together. We're aging together. You're going to get a copy of these slides, so you will see we've got some avoid in advance. These are themes that hopefully you have heard as we have been going through before. It's helpful sometimes to have a little bit of a checklist format, so that's why we put them together. You know, dynamic is a word that I don't think has come up in our conversation, but that's another way to use, you know, things are evolving, dynamic, growing, accumulated. Really important to emphasize that context and circumstances shape folks' decisions and outlook. The future is time for improvement. Interventions can change outlooks. And when we're talking about ageism, to remember that folks don't have a native understanding of ageism, we have to explain it. So I am going to open it up to questions. We've got 15 minutes left. And while I give you folks a minute to formulate your questions, I want to share some information. We're here today because there is this national initiative called the Reframing Aging Initiative that is a social change endeavor designed to improve the public's understanding of aging. You can see on the slide, there have been a tremendous number of national organizations that have been involved with this work. We are really, really grateful to the folks who initiated the work, the leaders of aging organizations, the funders who got it started, the initial phase of the research project, and the funders who continue to support the work. We're really fortunate to be part of this very large group of funders and supporters of the work. And there are some resources online, and there are some links that will be included in your resources. And then the last thing that I will say is I just want to clarify for folks, I was trained by Frameworks Institute. I'm not an employee of Frameworks. I work for Tufts Health Plan Foundation here in Massachusetts, where I'm the communications officer. But I'm always happy to answer your questions. And I also encourage you to visit reframingaging.org or Frameworks Institute for more information. So I'm going to go back to the question slide and look forward to hearing what you all have to say. I'm really pleased that we left time and we won't have to hopefully rush through.
So thank you, Ari. And I also wanted to supplement those sources, information sources, that we're hosting a Reframing Aging Masterclass. This is the 3-hour version featuring Ari and the director of the Age Strong Commission in the city of Boston, who put out that amazing Age Strong campaign. It's a 3-hour workshop where you get to literally bring your own marketing materials to the class. And with the expert facilitators, we'll go through those materials, and we'll do a lot of group work as well. So you get to not only leave the class with a refreshed marketing campaign, but you also become more aware of how to spot this in others and develop a peer community that you can continue the work going forward. So I put the link in the chat box there. One question that was fascinating that came in, Ari, is from a fundraising perspective. How do these words trigger, go from no to yes? What are you seeing to be more successful that actually gets people on board to your mission or to your company?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I will tell you, my colleague Janine, who went through the training with me, and I've done some co-presenting with. She calls herself a reformed fundraiser. She spent most of her career writing grant proposals, and she talks quite openly about the fact that part of fundraising training is crisis framing, right? Sky is falling in, urgency, must do this now. And what Frameworks has taught us is a couple of things. Number one is that it's really, really important to balance urgency and efficacy, that when there's this constant urgent, that folks are overwhelmed, and that triggers fatalism. And around this work, that fatalism is really problematic because it leads folks to, there's absolutely nothing I can do, this is so overwhelming. So that's one thing that I would say, and I too have a nonprofit background. I spent 20 plus years with the American Cancer Society, so I do understand how we were all taught to talk about that. But that's what the research shows, that those choices, because again, framing is choices. So those choices, you just have to understand, you may trigger folks who shut down and who are not open to what you're saying. So that's one thing that I would say. And then the other piece is, there's a lot of data, right? A lot of fundraising is we think the funder needs more information. And then human nature is, when we think folks aren't hearing us, we more, louder. When in fact, what the research tells us is, if you set the conversation up properly, which is, again, how do you lead? What do you start with? If you're leading with values, if you're leading with, this idea of ingenuity to work together, if you're leading with the value of maximum potential, the value of justice, and these are tested values that Frameworks has shown, open folks up, make them more receptive, make conversations more productive, you can still put in your data. Just be mindful of the way you're setting it up, so that you're not so heavy on the urgency and the crisis that you miss the efficacy piece.
Yeah, I love that, especially as you say, and it was even in your avoid slide, avoid talking about this as a crisis. It's not the crisis of aging. I mean, it'll be a crisis if we don't pay attention to it. but the idea is like, how can this also be framed in a more positive way? I'm just looking at my notes from our conversation. We have this one great phrase, I'm a 25-year-old with 31 years of experience, right? So, how to find common ground with the people that you're selling to. I think maybe that's kind of an interesting way to start, is to start with, okay, what do we have in common? What is our common frame of aging, or how we're aiming to help, the end consumer, and then build some common understanding. If that doesn't even click, then maybe kind of step out a little bit and say, well, what frame are people coming in with, right? And say, okay, so it's really the frameworks that have to be aligned. And then we can get back to the business of like the technical thing you're trying to sell, or the, nonprofit that you're trying to raise money for. Like, make sure that the frames are aligned, it seems.
And remember, we're not communicating into an empty fishbowl. We're communicating into folks who are coming to the conversation with cultural models. You know what they are now. So being mindful that your words can be queuing up some of the alligators that are going to eat your message. And, there's some subtleties to it that when I look back at some of the things that I reframed when I first did it, I look back now and I'm like, ooh, totally missed that. This work, a colleague in New Hampshire describes this as like being dipped in chocolate. So, you come today, you're a strawberry, you've been dipped in chocolate. Like, what's not good about being dipped in chocolate?
Mm-hmm.
But the next time you look at reframing, you get a little bit more chocolate, a little bit deeper, a little bit better coverage. That, you need a couple of doses sometimes to get the nuances. We try to keep getting it out there to folks. Another question, Danielle?
Yeah, and actually I'm going to ask Doug Dixon to unmute himself and ask this question. And Doug is one of our steering committee members for the Founders Over 55 Club, and one of our co-hosts for our next event at Agency for the Founders Over 55, and this is access to capital. One of the things that we're seeing a lot of ageism play out, unfortunately, is older entrepreneurs or experienced entrepreneurs who want to start a company in their late 50s, 60s, and so forth as a way, for their encore career. So, Doug, why don't you go ahead and unmute and ask this great question about innovation?
Sure. Hi, Ellery.
How are you?
Good, thanks. A lot of what we've talked about is relevant in the context of communications or marketing, but I think in the innovation world, the question also exists about how we shift the focus in terms of product development from compensating for frailty and need on the one hand, opening the door to possibilities for older adults on the other hand. That's a framing change, but it also makes a difference in terms of the direction of many of the efforts that are made to develop solutions.
I think that that's a really important point. And it's actually one of the reasons that I shared the maximizing potential example before the building momentum. Frameworks will tell you that the building momentum, I think I said this, tested off the charts. But my sense was from my conversations with Danielle that a lot of the products and services that the folks that you work with are doing are things like the walking wheelchair, the GPS-enabled watch, the cane wraps, are things that really allow older people to have more independence, more agency. I was trying to think of another word, but I couldn't. So you got me, Danielle. So to really be mindful of what language will evoke that for you. I thought that thinking about that maximizing potential as a value might be helpful for those conversations. And I will also say that the reality is we're talking not about maximizing the potential to look or have the same abilities of a 20-year-old, right? To be able to maximize your potential if you need to use a cane, if you are using a wheelchair, if you have a vision loss or a hearing loss, that recognizing that we're not talking about creating sort of an ableist view of what it means to maximize your potential. So I think that's something to keep in mind too, which might sometimes be a little bit harder, because we we forget that we could
Well, and this is Karen Upstill. I think what Doug is saying is, I work in digital healthcare solutions, managing health plans and hospitals. Tough Health Plans that's my, not only has it been my client, but it's also my health plan. I love the work you do, but I think the reframing also has to come with payers and health insurance that pay for benefits and services only starting at, once we've had an accident and fallen in our home, or once, like you said, Doug, the frail and the elderly, those are constantly used for falls prevention. Well, we want to start that when you're 55. We don't want you having an accident. These products, like you say, and services can also serve over a lifetime, so we all live a healthier and mobile life.
Yeah, and I hear that. Sorry, go ahead, Doug.
I just wanted to say I want to make the connection to what Margaret said about products in Japan. It's not just Japan. It's to some extent here, although maybe to a lesser extent, where we're trying to enable people at an earlier age when they don't have a need for a cane or a wheelchair, to live a full life, to live a life that they feel doesn't require them to, to try to act like they're kids instead of, like their age.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I was thinking that because that agency is part of our community, we don't necessarily lean in towards companies that are like doing the potions and the lotions and the forever young, because that's not really the message, right? The message is meet people where they are, help them live the fullness of their life, and what kind of innovation do you need to do that? And if it's a fancy cane wrap, so you're not embarrassed to go out, great, you're not going to fall, you're not going to be isolated, and you're going to feel pretty darn fashionable, where the cane is just a fashion accessory as opposed to a stigma. And that's a super no-tech example, and then we have very technical examples. And so I'm loving this this input from Lori, that it's not about trying to rewind the clock backwards to make you feel like you were back at a certain age,
right?
But to live in the moment, right, and keep that momentum going.
Exactly. And yeah, and I also just want to, we're closing in on time. There's one slide that Danielle specifically wanted me to share, but I think we could probably squeeze in one question before I share the slide, if there's any more questions.
I had a comment to make. I didn't know. Hey, Danielle, David, hi guys.
Hi.
This is fantastic. I came in late and I apologize for that, but I just thought this was a very important agenda that might already be happening, where you are making heroes out of your audience that deserves to be made heroes out of, where they're celebrity or they're leaders, and it's like an ongoing campaign where we are reminded that you earn your place in this world, and we all have so much to offer. It could be anywhere. It could be a thought. It could be a great story, an experience. It could be hands-on. It could be as good as any 30-year-old. Is there an effort that anyone here on this call is working on to have that kind of a campaign to share and remind people how great everybody is?
So there is something similar. Are you familiar with the Age Strong campaign happening in Boston?
A little bit, yeah.
So those are real Bostonians, and they've been lifted up to show what their to dispel the misperceptions around aging. And I think Cassie did a really great job with that. There was a similar campaign that was also happening in San Francisco that actually ironically launched just a few weeks after Boston. They didn't know the other was working on it, but I haven't seen anything else. And I'd love it to hear that I'm wrong and that there's something going on, because I think that's a really great idea.
Well, AARP does some of that stuff too. I mean, that is the mission.
There have been several campaigns, but we need a lot more.
Yeah.
Well, and I see her, Margaret was saying, like, what is it going to take to undo some of this ageism that's just so deeply embedded? And I think we could look to Hollywood and to what's happening in some of the movements. Like, let's change the narrative, even in the stories that we consume through the media, right? So not all of the parts for older people have this frailty or have this, inertia about it, right? So that there's this vibrancy and diversity in the narrative. The stories that we hear.
And we all have an opportunity to call it when we see it. I mean, that's what I say. You know, we can speak with our dollars. What kind of birthday cards are we buying? You know, I have a couple of family members who are a little tired probably of me sharing my thoughts about, like, I just don't think that's funny. You know, oh, you're no fun. I just quit. It's not funny, you know. But we do it unconsciously. Or she looks great for her age. My dad actually thought he was complimenting me recently. He introduced me to somebody and he said, oh, you know, doesn't she look great for her age? I'm like, what? You know. But so I think we all have an opportunity and a responsibility to be mindful that that's happening and that we can say something and change it. And that's what a movement is, right? We're all coming together and we're doing it a little bit at a time, and hopefully we're moving it forward. So Danielle, the slide that you wanted to make sure that I shared is this is just really for your information, folks. So language evolves, right? Words change. And in this country, there has been quite a bit of evolution around the idea of how we describe older people. And so Frameworks did a quick research survey, and they asked people to look at these words and rate them, rank them on a scale, and say, you know, who is the most competent and who is the least competent. And the top line shows you that, generally speaking, and I want to be really clear because this is not the case in certain communities. We know Native populations revere their elders. We know Asian populations and a lot of African-American communities. So this is generalized across the United States. The word elder or elderly was considered least competent, and folks who are described as older adults were considered most competent. And so that is why the foundation is really conscious about the language that we use. The American Medical Association has recently changed their guidelines. Associated Press has recently changed their style guide. It's used by major newspapers across the country. So the idea of using older people, older person, and older adult is really important for all of us when we can. I recognize it, that's not always possible. The bottom line is fascinating because it kind of evokes the poll, right? You know, if I put these words in front of you, rank them by age. So you can see seniors are 69 and older people are 64. Oddly, older adults were considered 54. So for the foundation, we tend to use older people or older person because what we are trying to cue is a competent person who is 60, 65 plus. You know, that's generally what we're trying to cue. So we do use older adults sometimes, but we're aware that that cues a slightly younger person. So I just wanted to share that. The language is evolving. It is not just based on you know, style of the day, but we were really grateful to the folks at the GSA, the Gerontological Society of America, and the folks who are managing the Reframing Aging initiative, because they have been helping to push forward with some of these style guides and some of these major organizations to the point that we were just making, right? That if we want to change this and see changes in movies and newspapers and magazines, we have to do some systems changes too, in addition to the work we're all doing on the ground. So.
Wonderful. Well, that is a great rallying cry and call to action for all of us. So Ulrich, thank you so much for your wisdom, your enthusiasm, your commitment to this field, and your willingness to share this so generously with us. I know the online format, this is typically an in-person workshop. So thank you to all the participants who tuned in. I know a lot of people had some issues logging in. It's kind of a Zoom thing. We will have recorded this session, so we will make it available on the agency website and the Venture Cafe website. We will be sharing Ulrich's slides, but really we hope that we get to hang out with you more. So join us at agency, and if you're interested in taking your materials and really digging in, please join us in the masterclass. It's a limited class of 20 people only. So again, thank you to Tufts Health Plan Foundation for funding this work, and thanks to all of you. So have a great rest of your day and fabulous weekend. And we really appreciate everybody's participation.
Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Ulrich. Thank you, Danielle. It was great having you. It was a wonderful discussion. I can see there's still conversations going in chat, so a lot of compliments. Thank you for doing this. We have one more session going on. You can go back to vencav.org, sign in to attend. It is a town hall we are hosting on Innovation is for Everyone, a discussion on racial equity. So feel free to join and have a conversation with us. And with that, hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks, Yulia. Thanks, everybody.